My name is Claire, and I am 30 years old, and for most of my life I have carried silence like a second skin, but on that night, silence was shattered by the sound of splintering wood, because the man who called himself my stepfather lifted a chair as though it weighed nothing and brought it down across my back with such force that the room shook. The crack was so loud I thought it came from inside my own body, and a flash of white pain ripped through me as I collapsed face first onto the linoleum floor. The television in the living room blasted a football game, and the commentator's cheerful voice became an insult against the agony that filled my body. My chest seized as I tried to breathe, and the sharp ache in my ribs told me something inside had cracked. I wanted to scream, but the sound that came out was a weak whimper. He stood above me with heavy breaths and a sick grin, muttering that I should have kept quiet and calling me worthless and pathetic. I clawed at the floor, my palms sliding across the greasy tiles, dragging my battered body toward the front door, because all I could think was that if I stayed, another blow would come. My fingertips brushed the doorknob, and hope flickered in me for a heartbeat, but then I heard the metallic click of the lock sliding shut. I lifted my head and saw her, my mother. She was standing at the door with her hand still resting on the key she had just turned. Her face was calm, but then her lips curled into the faintest smirk, a smirk that cut deeper than the chair ever could, and I felt the cold realization that the woman who gave me life was choosing him over me. I whispered her name, a plea wrapped in disbelief, but she tilted her head and said, "I always turned nothing into a spectacle." She told me no one would believe me if I cried out. Her voice was soft, like she was scolding me for making a mess, not like she was watching her daughter bleeding on the floor. Behind me, I heard my stepfather laugh as he kicked the shattered chair aside and told me I should be grateful he had not done worse. My muscles trembled as I tried to push myself up again, but I fell on my elbows and warm blood ran down my side where the wood had split my skin. The air reeked of overcooked meat and lemon cleaner, the nauseating scent of a house that pretended to be normal. I stared at the pattern of white and gray squares on the floor, wishing I could leave my body and float away, but I was trapped in a house where even the air had been claimed by him. My mother walked past me without bending down, poured herself a glass of wine, and told me to stop being dramatic, said I had ruined another evening. My stepfather blew cigarette smoke in my direction, and it curled above me like a cruel reminder that even the oxygen belonged to him. My tears burned the cut on my lip, and every nerve in me wanted to surrender. But deep inside, a voice rose faint but steady, reminding me that they could not take everything. I still had my memory, my truth, and even if they locked the door and laughed at my pain, there was something inside me that would not die. I pressed my face to the tile and bit back the sob, telling myself that they thought I would stay silent, but they had no idea what I was about to do next. I grew up in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. A place where secrets traveled faster than the wind and reputations were guarded like family heirlooms. But behind the closed doors of our little house, those secrets became scars that no one saw. My father died when I was 9, a car accident that ripped through our lives in a single phone call, leaving me and my mother in a silence so thick it felt like the walls themselves were mourning. For a short time, I thought grief would pull us together, that my mother and I would become inseparable, two broken souls clinging to each other, but instead, she hardened as if his death was a punishment handed down to her, and I was the reminder she couldn't escape. When she remarried 2 years later, she smiled for the first time in months, and I remember thinking, maybe things would finally be better. Maybe this man who put his arm around her in the grocery store and helped carry our bags would become a steady figure in our fragile lives. But what entered our home was not steadiness, it was a storm. My stepfather had a voice that could fill a room and fists that followed his words, and in those early years I learned how quickly love could sour into fear. At school, I became quiet, always staring at my notebook because I had already learned that the less you speak, the safer you are. My teachers called me shy, my classmates ignored me, but what none of them saw were the bruises hidden beneath my sleeves, or the way I flinched whenever a door slammed too hard. My mother once, the woman who brushed my hair and told me bedtime stories, began siding with him, laughing at his cruel jokes, telling me to stop exaggerating whenever I tried to explain the pain. It was as if she had handed him a script and chosen to play supporting role in his performance of power. I can still remember one night when I was 12, we were eating dinner, the air thick with silence, and I dropped my fork by accident. It clattered against the linoleum, a sound so small and meaningless, but my stepfather's eyes lit with anger. He shoved me back so hard, my chair scraped across the floor, and when I looked to my mother for help, she just smirked, as if the scene was mildly amusing, as if my humiliation was entertainment. That smirk stayed with me for years. It became the image of betrayal carved into my mind. I started spending more time outside, wandering the edges of town, just to avoid the house, and that is where I first met Mrs. Riley, the elderly neighbor who sometimes gave me cookies and asked about school. She had a softness my home lacked, and though I never told her everything, she would look at me with eyes that seemed to understand more than I said. In those stolen moments, I realized not all adults were cruel, that kindness could exist even in small doses, and those tiny glimpses of care kept me from drowning completely in despair. Yet every time I stepped back into the house, the cycle repeated: the yelling, the slamming doors, the punishments for mistakes so trivial they barely existed. By the time I reached 16, I had developed habits of survival that shaped my every move. I learned how to anticipate the sound of his footsteps, how to clean perfectly, so he had nothing to criticize, how to smile faintly when my mother demanded I show gratitude for the roof over my head. On the outside, I was a normal teenager attending school dances, doing homework, laughing occasionally with friends, but inside, I was a prisoner, always calculating, always bracing. The cruelest part was the isolation, because even when I hinted to friends that things were bad at home, they would shrug and say, all parents are tough sometimes, or you just have to respect authority. They couldn't imagine that a mother could choose her husband over her own child, that a smile at church could mask bruises hidden under a sweater. My heart hardened with that knowledge, and I carried it like a stone in my chest. Looking back, I realized those years were the foundation of what was to come, the constant erosion of my confidence, the relentless reminder that I was alone. Yet somewhere buried beneath the fear was a stubborn spark, a refusal to let them define me completely. I wrote in secret journals poems about escape stories about girls who found freedom, and though I often tore them up in fear of discovery, the act of writing reminded me that my voice still existed even if no one heard it. That voice would become my lifeline later, but at the time, it was only a whisper. Still, that whisper meant hope, and hope was the one thing they hadn't managed to crush. By the time I was 18, I had perfected the art of pretending everything was fine to the outside world. I was just another small town girl who kept her grades up and showed up to church on Sundays, but inside, I lived in constant tension. A string pulled so tight I thought it might snap at any moment. Yet I still hoped that once I left for college, I would finally be free. That distance could loosen the chains my stepfather and mother had wrapped around me. For a brief moment, it almost felt possible I had been accepted to a community college one town over, and the thought of moving into a dorm gave me a taste of freedom I had never known. But my stepfather had other plans. He insisted it was a waste of money, that I should stay home, commute, save, be grateful, and of course my mother nodded along as if the idea had been hers all along. So I stayed, I endured, and I tried to carve out pockets of normal life within the walls that suffocated me. I got a part-time job at a small diner on Main Street, the kind of place with peeling red booths and coffee that never tasted fresh, but kept the town running. And for the first time, I had my own paycheck, my own reason to leave the house, my own space where people called me by name without spitting it like an insult. I remember the feeling of wiping down counters and hearing the bell ring as regulars came in smiling at me, asking how school was going. Their voices normal kind, so different from the clipped tones I heard at home, and though it was ordinary, it felt like oxygen. Sometimes after my shift, I would linger, talking with the cook or sharing fries with a coworker, small rituals that reminded me life could be more than bruises and silence. In those days, I began to dream bigger, imagining a future where I might save enough to move out to rent a small apartment to finally claim a piece of independence. But dreams in that house were dangerous, and my stepfather made sure to remind me of that. If I came home late, he would accuse me of being ungrateful if I saved money. He would demand I contribute to bills if I dared to mention moving out. He would laugh and say, "You think you can make it without us? You are nothing on your own." My mother echoed his words, her smile sharp. telling me I should appreciate the security of family, that the world outside was crueler than anything inside these walls, and though I knew deep down it was a lie, it still sank into my bones, leaving me doubting my own strength. The cruel irony was that my stepfather played the role of upstanding citizen so well that no one suspected what happened at home. He shook hands at church, volunteered for neighborhood projects, and everyone called him reliable. Strong, a man who stepped up for a widow and her child. And when I heard those words, I felt sick, trapped by the mask he wore so perfectly. Still, I clung to my tiny moments of control. My job, my notebooks filled with plans, the rare afternoons when I stayed late at the library just to feel safe. It was during one of those afternoons that I realized how much I had adapted to survive, how I flinched at every loud noise, how my body carried tension like armor, and it scared me to think that maybe this was permanent. Maybe the damage was already too deep. Yet even in that fear, there was a stubborn streak of resistance, a quiet promise I whispered to myself at night that one day I would leave that. One day I would not just survive, but escape. But survival had a cost, and living under his roof meant obeying his rules, rules that shifted like sand depending on his mood rules that left me constantly second-guessing. One evening, I came home from the diner with my hair smelling faintly of grease and my shoes squeaking from the rain, and he was waiting in the living room. His eyes narrowed, asking where I had been as if the answer were not obvious. And when I showed him my pay stub, he ripped it in half, telling me money made me arrogant, telling me work would not save me. My mother sat beside him smirking, nodding, adding her own twist of cruelty by reminding me that without them, I would be homeless. I wanted to scream to fight back, but I swallowed the rage because screaming only brought more violence, and I had learned the art of silence too well. Still inside me, the spark grew brighter. The more they tried to break me, the more determined I became, and I began to plan quietly, carefully, imagining ways to gather evidence, imagining the moment when their lies would unravel. At that point, I did not yet know how or when, but I knew the day would come, and that certainty became my secret weapon. For now, I smiled when they demanded it. I nodded when they dictated my future. I kept my head down, but in my heart, I was no longer the helpless child they thought I was. I was waiting, and waiting can be a form of power too. By the time I turned 20, the weight of my stepfather's control had become unbearable, and the silence of my mother had sharpened into a blade that cut deeper than his fists. Yet something inside me had started to shift, a flicker of rebellion that I could not suppress anymore. A quiet defiance that grew every time they told me I was nothing without them. It began in small ways, like refusing to hand over my full paycheck instead, hiding a portion in the lining of my old backpack, and though it was risky, the act of keeping something for myself felt intoxicating, like tasting freedom for the first time. I also stopped smiling on command, no longer plastering a fake grin whenever my mother nudged me at church, and though she glared at me for it, I held my ground, letting her see that her grip was loosening. Of course, my stepfather noticed, too, his temper flaring at even the smallest signs of independence, and the punishments became harsher, his words more cutting his fists more frequent. One night, after a long shift at the diner, I walked through the door, exhausted, only to find him sitting in the kitchen with my mother, the air heavy. The pay envelope I had hidden partially discovered, and the rage in his eyes told me I was caught. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting that I had betrayed his trust, that I was a thief under his roof. And before I could explain, he grabbed me by the collar and shoved me against the wall, the breath leaving my lungs in a painful gasp. My mother stood by with that same smirk, the same expression I had seen since childhood, as though my suffering was a performance meant to amuse her. That night, I lay in bed with bruises blooming across my chest, and I made myself a promise that if they wanted me silent forever, they would fail because I was done being their victim. From then on, I began documenting everything, scribbling notes in hidden journals, marking dates and times of every outburst, every bruise, every cruel word, even sneaking photos with an old phone I had managed to save. It was dangerous, but it gave me power. It gave me proof. And for the first time, the fear began to shift into determination. I also started to test boundaries in other ways, staying longer at the diner, walking home slowly to savor the fresh air. Sometimes sitting on the swings at the park until dusk just to feel like I owned a piece of the world. Those small rebellions were the cracks forming in the walls they had built around me. The escalation came to a head one weekend when my stepfather hosted a barbecue for neighbors, playing the role of charming family man flipping burgers with a grin, while my mother paraded around bragging about how lucky she was to have such a strong husband. I stood there holding a tray of drinks, my arm aching from a bruise hidden beneath my sleeve, and I remember locking eyes with Mrs. Riley, the neighbor who had always looked at me with quiet understanding. She raised an eyebrow as if she sensed something was wrong, and in that moment, I almost wanted to tell her everything, but fear held me back. Still, her look ignited something inside me, a reminder that there were witnesses beyond these walls, that the truth could one day come to light. After the guests left, my stepfather accused me of being rude for not smiling enough, his voice booming as he dragged me back inside, and when I tried to defend myself, he struck me with the back of his hand so hard I tasted blood. My mother only sighed, telling me I should know better, and once again I was left trembling but unbroken, because beneath the fear a fire was growing. I began to imagine ways to expose them publicly, ways to ensure that their masks would crumble in front of everyone they worked so hard to impress. At the diner, I overheard conversations about social media, about how quickly reputations could unravel with a single post, and an idea started to form an idea that terrified and thrilled me at the same time. If I could gather enough evidence, if I could share it at the right moment, maybe I could not only free myself but also destroy the image they clung to. That thought became my secret rebellion, my quiet weapon. Meanwhile, the violence at home only worsened his kicks, leaving me curled on the floor, his grip on my arm, leaving dark fingerprints, my mother's laughter echoing like a cruel soundtrack. Yet each act of cruelty only added fuel to my resolve. I stopped believing their words, stopped letting their gaslighting sink in, and though they still hurt me physically, mentally, I was beginning to rise above them. The turning point came late one night when he smashed a chair across my back in a fit of rage, the wood splintering pain, shooting through me until I could barely breathe. And as I tried to crawl away, my mother walked calmly to the door, locked it and smirked as if sealing me inside my own prison. In that moment, despite the agony, I realized something profound, that they could try to break my body, but they would never touch the part of me that was planning waiting, preparing for the day I would turn the tables. That night, as I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, my ribs aching, my chest heavy, I whispered to myself over and over, one day, and those words carried me through the darkness. The night that everything finally snapped was colder than usual, a sharp wind rattling the windows as if the house itself wanted to escape. And I remember sitting at the small desk in my room, clutching my journal with trembling hands because I had just finished writing down another entry about the bruise on my arm, the fresh welt on my ribs, the insult that still echoed in my ears. But this time, my heart was pounding with something stronger than fear. It was rage mixed with clarity, and I knew I could not keep living this way much longer. I had hidden money in my backpack, small bills stuffed in an envelope beneath the lining. I had taken photos of my bruises. I had written down every date, every quote, every cruel word, and yet none of it had been enough to stop them, because still, every night he found a reason to punish me, and every night my mother found a reason to smile at my pain, until the weight of their cruelty pressed so hard that something inside me began to break. That night, after a long shift at the diner, I came home later than usual, hoping maybe they would already be asleep, but when I stepped inside the living room, the lights were still on, and my stepfather sat in his chair with a beer in his hand, his face twisted in anger. My mother perched beside him like a queen waiting for the show to begin, and before I could even take off my coat, he accused me of stealing from him again, of hiding money, of planning to abandon them. I tried to defend myself, my voice shaking, but firm, telling him I had earned that money and deserved to keep a piece of it for myself. And in that instant, his face turned crimson, as if I had uttered the worst blasphemy. He rose with terrifying speed, grabbed me by the hair, and slammed me to the floor so hard the wind was knocked out of me. And as I struggled to breathe, he kicked me in the side with the force of a man determined to crush something fragile beneath his boot. I heard a crack, sharp and sickening pain radiating through my ribs, and I gasped, clutching my side. The world spinning while my mother leaned back in her chair and actually laughed, her smirk curling into a grin as though she was watching her favorite performance. In that moment, as I lay bleeding on the floor, ribs, broken breath shallow, I realized this was the breaking point, not just of my body, but of my spirit, because even though pain tore through me, something in my mind shifted from victim to fighter. I remember thinking, if I survive this night, I will not just endure, I will destroy them. I will take everything they think they are and strip it bare in front of the world, and that thought burned hotter than the pain in my chest. He dragged me across the carpet, muttering that I would never leave this house alive, that I was his property, that my mother had given up on me long ago. And when he threw me against the wall again, I felt another jolt of agony, but I also felt my rage solidify into resolve. I stopped crying. I stopped pleading, and instead, I stared at them with a calm I had never felt before, a calm that unsettled him for a moment because he paused, his hand frozen mid-air, perhaps, sensing that his hold on me was slipping. My mother narrowed her eyes, perhaps seeing it too, and she hissed that I should wipe that look off my face before he wiped it for me. But I only kept staring, silent, unbroken, because in my mind I was already somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere free, planning the final act that would bring them down. After he stormed out, leaving me crumpled in the corner, I crawled back to my room inch by inch. Each breath a struggle, each movement searing with pain, but my mind sharper than it had ever been, and I pulled out my phone from its hiding place and began to scroll through the evidence I had collected. Photo after photo of bruises, audio recordings of his screams, written notes of dates and injuries, all lined up like soldiers ready for battle. And I knew then that this was not just survival anymore, it was war. That night, I made a decision I would not wait for a miracle. I would create one, and I whispered to myself again and again, they will regret underestimating me. They will pay for every scar, every tear, every drop of blood, and one day the world will see them for what they truly are. The breaking point was not the moment of pain. It was the moment I decided to stop hiding, to stop enduring, to fight back. Not with fists, but with evidence, with exposure, with truth so undeniable that even their fake smiles could not cover it. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I clutched my phone to my chest like a lifeline, like a weapon, like a promise that the end of their reign was near. The morning after that brutal night, I woke with my ribs aching so badly that every breath felt like fire, but my mind was clearer than ever because I knew there was no turning back. I had crossed a threshold inside myself, and what lived there now was not fear, but determination. I moved slowly each step, sending waves of pain through my chest, but I forced myself to stand in front of the mirror, looking at the purple bruises that spread across my side, like ink stains, the swelling along my jaw, the cuts that lined my arms, and instead of despair, I felt an odd kind of strength, because these marks were proof. These marks were evidence, and I would not let them fade into silence like so many before. At breakfast, my stepfather acted as if nothing had happened, buttering toast with the smug ease of a man convinced his power was absolute, while my mother sipped her coffee and asked me why I looked so pale. Her voice dripping with mockery, and I sat there quiet, clutching the secret inside me, like a flame smiling faintly, because they had no idea that I had already begun their undoing. The first step was securing my evidence. So as soon as I left the house under the guise of going to class, I went instead to the library computer lab and transferred every photo, every audio recording, every written note onto a hidden cloud account, one with a password so complex even I had to write it down. And then I emailed copies to myself from an anonymous account, creating a trail that no amount of smashing my phone could erase. Sitting there under the hum of fluorescent lights, surrounded by students who were busy with essays and coffee cups, I felt an unfamiliar sense of control, like I was building armor out of the very wounds they had inflicted. The second step was finding allies, but I knew I had to be careful because the danger of speaking out too soon was real. So I started small by confiding in a coworker at the diner, someone who had noticed my bruises before but never pushed. and when I told her the truth, she didn't flinch, she didn't doubt me. She simply said, "You cannot do this alone," and wrote down the number of her cousin who worked at a local shelter. That night, after closing shift, standing in the alley behind the diner with the smell of grease and cigarettes in the air, I called the number. My voice shaking, and spoke to a calm woman who told me that what was happening to me was not just cruel but criminal, and that there were ways to fight back. Legal ways, safe ways, but only if I was ready to gather more than just bruises if I was ready to catch them in the act. Her words planted a seed, and from that day forward I carried my phone everywhere, keeping the recorder app ready at all times, pretending obedience, while secretly documenting every insult, every threat, every strike. I even placed a small notebook under the couch cushion in the living room, jotting down dates and times when they argued, when he drank too much, when she joined in his cruelty, and little by little my archive grew into a mountain too heavy to be denied. The third step was patience. And patience is the hardest weapon to wield because every night I wanted to scream the truth to the world every time he raised his hand. I wanted to shout that I had proof. But I knew the timing had to be perfect. The exposure had to be public, undeniable, devastating. So I played the role they expected. I kept my head down. I endured their sneers, but inside I was rehearsing the final act, the moment when the curtain would fall on their performance and reveal the monsters behind the masks. Sometimes I caught my mother watching me with suspicion, as if she sensed that something in me had shifted, and once she even asked why I was so quiet lately. But I only smiled and said I was tired from work, letting her think I was beaten down when in reality I was sharpening my blade. I began researching the laws, learning about protective orders, about evidence submission, about how abusers often crumble when confronted with undeniable proof, and I bookmarked everything on my hidden account, reading late into the night under the cover of blankets. Ribs still aching, but heart racing with possibility. I also studied their patterns, noting when he drank the most, when her cruelty peaked when their guard was down, and I realized that weekends were the worst because that was when they gathered neighbors or church friends, when they played the happy family role most aggressively, when their performance reached its highest peak, and it was in those moments that the contrast between the truth and their facade would be most damning. So I decided that my counterattack would not be quiet. It would not be whispered in a lawyer's office or hidden in police reports. It would be revealed in front of the very people they sought to impress, the very audience they cherished. That idea both thrilled and terrified me, but the more I thought about it, the more I knew it was right, because exposing them in public would strip them of the one weapon they valued most, their reputation. Over the following weeks, I endured more violence, more insults, but each wound only fueled me further. Each scar reminding me that justice was not just a dream, but a plan in motion. I tested my phone recorder again and again, making sure the sound was clear, that voices carried, and when I captured him yelling that he would break my ribs again if I defied him, my mother laughing in the background, I listened to it over and over until the sound burned into me like fuel. That recording became my strongest card, the piece that would shatter their mask once revealed, and I guarded it like treasure. My body was battered, but my spirit was steeled, and as I lay awake each night, I whispered to myself that the day of reckoning was coming soon, that their cruelty would no longer be hidden in shadows, that one day soon the world would see them for exactly who they were. The day I chose for the exposure was a Sunday afternoon because Sundays were when my stepfather invited his church friends and neighbors over for barbecues in the backyard, and my mother wore her brightest smile and played the role of a perfect hostess. And I knew that in front of these people whose opinions they craved most, the truth would sting the hardest, so I prepared carefully, making sure my phone was fully charged. My backup recorder was hidden in my jacket, and the crucial audio file was ready to play at a moment's notice. That morning, as I dressed slowly, my ribs still aching though less than before, I felt a calmness settle over me, not the calm of resignation, but of resolve. Because I had waited patiently, I had endured long enough, and now the time had come to show the world what lay behind our front door. The guests began to arrive, carrying pies and potato salad. their laughter filling the air as the smell of grilled meat drifted through the yard, and my stepfather strutted around with a beer in hand, slapping shoulders and boasting about his hard work, while my mother flitted from guest to guest, pretending to be the caring wife and mother who held everything together. I moved quietly among them, greeting people politely, clutching my phone like a lifeline, and though my stomach churned with nerves, my eyes stayed sharp because I knew the moment had to be chosen with precision, the perfect blend of cruelty and performance, so that when the mask cracked, the impact would be undeniable. The opportunity came sooner than I expected when one of the guests complimented me on my grades in college, and my stepfather laughed loud and hard, then sneered that books could not teach a worthless girl manners, and before anyone could react, he shoved me hard against the patio railing, the sudden jolt sending a flash of pain through my ribs, and the guests gasped, some nervous, some shocked, but my mother was quick to laugh it off, saying, "Oh, he is just teasing. She needs to toughen up," and in that moment, I knew the stage was set. I steadied myself, breathing through the pain, and then I said nothing at first, just pulled my phone from my pocket, pressed play on the recording, and held it up for everyone to hear. The sound filled the yard, his voice booming with rage, captured on a night when he had screamed that he would break my ribs again if I disobeyed, my mother's laughter ringing in the background, and as the recording echoed across the lawn, the silence among the guests grew heavy like a storm ready to break. My stepfather's face drained of color, his eyes darting from neighbor to neighbor, while my mother froze mid-laugh, her smile collapsing into something cold and desperate. But it was too late because the words were out. The truth was out, and the audience they cherished so much was hearing exactly who they really were. One woman clutched her husband's arm, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Another man shook his head in disgust, muttering, "This is sick," and I stood taller despite the pain, watching the fortress of lies they had built crumble in real time. My stepfather tried to snatch the phone from my hand, but I pulled back and shouted loud enough for all to hear that this was not the first time. This was years of abuse hidden behind closed doors, years of bruises and broken bones, while my mother turned her head and smiled, and I let my voice tremble, but not with fear, with fury, and the truth poured out of me like fire, unstoppable, undeniable. The guests stared in horror, some stepping back as if to distance themselves from the monsters they had once admired, and one brave neighbor demanded, "Is this true? Did you really do this?" And my mother stammered, trying to weave excuses, but the recording still played his threats. Her laughter overlapping with her frantic words, and the weight of proof drowned out her lies. My stepfather's anger erupted, then his voice rising as he shouted that I was ungrateful, that I was destroying the family. But his words sounded hollow, desperate, and the more he spoke, the more transparent his mask became. I raised my shirt, just enough to reveal the dark bruises still blooming across my ribs, and gasps rippled through the crowd, a woman covering her mouth in shock, a man shaking his head and stepping forward to shield me from my stepfather's looming presence. The tide had turned, and I felt it in my bones that this was no longer just my fight. It was a reckoning that everyone could see, and no amount of smiling or smirking could erase. My stepfather lunged again, but this time 2 of the guests intercepted him, holding him back as he flailed and cursed, and I used that moment to speak clearly to every face in that yard, telling them that this was the truth, that they could pretend not to see it, but the evidence was right here, and I would never be silent again. Phones began to appear. Guests recording the scene, their cameras capturing his rage, my bruises, my mother's stunned silence, and I felt a surge of triumph because this was not just exposure. It was documentation. It was proof that would live beyond this moment. Finally, someone called the police, and when the sirens wailed in the distance, my stepfather's bravado collapsed into panic, his struggles weakening as reality sank in, and my mother's eyes darted wildly, searching for someone to believe her, but finding only judgment in every gaze. When the officers arrived, I handed them the recordings, the photos, the files I had so carefully collected, and the witnesses spoke up too, confirming what they had seen that day and what they had just heard. And though my stepfather raged and my mother tried to insist it was a misunderstanding, the truth was far too loud to be buried. As they were led away in handcuffs, my body trembled with exhaustion and relief, the bruises still aching, but my spirit soaring because I had done it. I had turned their violence into their downfall, their cruelty into their public shame. I stood in that yard surrounded by neighbors who now looked at me not with pity but with respect. And I realized that the power they had stolen from me for years had been reclaimed in that single act of exposure. When the squad car pulled away with my stepfather shouting obscenities through the window and my mother sitting stone-faced beside him, I stood frozen on the lawn, my phone still warm in my hand, the weight of years lifting slowly like a heavy fog finally breaking apart, and the silence left behind was thick but no longer suffocating, because for the first time it was not the silence of secrets. It was the silence of truth, hanging in the air, undeniable and witnessed by all. The neighbors lingered, some awkward, some sympathetic, their faces still pale from what they had seen, and one older woman approached me gently, laying a hand on my shoulder and whispering, "You are safe now, child." And though the words made my chest tighten with a rush of long-buried grief, they also sparked something fierce and steady inside me because safe was not a word I had ever associated with home until this moment. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded quickly. The police filed charges of assault and child endangerment. Though I was grown, they said the pattern of abuse warranted serious attention, and with the recordings and witnesses, the case was strong. My stepfather lost his job almost instantly when word spread through the community, and my mother, who had once basked in the admiration of neighbors, found herself isolated. Doors closing when she tried to visit friends. Invitations withdrawn and whispers following her wherever she went. At first, I struggled with guilt because no matter how cruel they had been, they were still the people who raised me, but every time I questioned myself, I traced the outline of fading bruises along my ribs or replayed the sound of his threats and her laughter, and I reminded myself that accountability was not cruelty, it was justice. I moved out within a week into a small apartment with peeling paint, but sunlight streaming through the windows, and for the first time in my life, I chose every item that entered my space, from the second-hand couch to the chipped dishes, and each choice felt like a declaration of independence, proof that I could build a life on my own terms. Nights were the hardest because memories crept in, the echo of slammed doors, the sting of insults, but instead of drowning in them, I began to write filling journals with every detail I could recall, turning pain into narrative, into evidence, into something I could shape and control rather than something that controlled me. Therapy followed, recommended by a neighbor who had seen everything that day, and though at first I resisted, afraid that speaking it out loud would make it too real, I found that in the safety of those sessions, I discovered parts of myself I thought had been erased. Compassion, resilience, humor, buried under years of survival instinct. My therapist reminded me often that survival itself was an act of defiance, and that reclaiming joy even in small doses was a revolution, and so I began to seek joy in the simplest ways, cooking a meal without fear of criticism, humming to myself as I painted my walls a soft blue, even allowing myself to laugh when a sitcom played on the battered television. The trial, months later, was grueling, but standing in the courtroom with the recordings playing once again and the neighbors testifying on my behalf, I felt no fear, only strength, because this time I was not alone, and every lie my mother tried to spin unraveled under the weight of evidence. The verdict brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. My stepfather received prison time, my mother probation and mandatory counseling. But what mattered most was the acknowledgement from the court that what I had endured was real, that it mattered that I mattered. Afterward, some relatives who had once turned a blind eye reached out awkward apologies, fumbling in their voices, and though forgiveness was not something I could offer easily, I accepted their recognition because it proved that silence was no longer an option. Over time, I built new relationships, friendships that felt like family, chosen not by blood, but by kindness and respect. And slowly the word family began to heal, reshaping itself into something that did not wound. One evening, sitting by my window watching the sunset paint the sky, I realized that the cycle had broken. The violence had not swallowed me whole, and I had carved out a space where my voice was not only heard, but valued. I thought back to that moment on the lawn when the recording played and the truth spilled into the open, and I understood that exposure had been more than revenge. It had been reclamation, taking back the narrative of my life from the people who tried to define it through fear. The scars, both visible and hidden, remain, but they are no longer marks of shame. They are proof of endurance, reminders that even in the darkest nights, I had chosen to survive and eventually to fight back. Now, when I walk past families laughing in parks, or see fathers lifting their children onto their shoulders, I do not feel envy, only a bittersweet ache and then gratitude that I have the freedom to shape my future differently, to create a life where love does not come with bruises and control does not masquerade as care. My journey is far from over-healing, is not a finish line, but a path winding and uneven. Yet with every step I feel steadier, stronger, and when people ask about my story, I tell it without flinching because silence is what allowed the violence to thrive, and speaking is what set me free. The final act of defiance is to live fully, to laugh loudly, to build a home filled with peace. And in that simple daily resistance, I find my truest revenge because they wanted me broken, hidden, erased. But here I am, visible, unbroken, and determined to remain so.